The decision to ruin her life was not made in a flash of temper, but in the quiet, suffocating stillness of the conservatory. Ilara Chilton stood behind a potted fern, its fronds like delicate green bones, and watched the glittering ballroom through the glass. It was a world away, a universe of shimmering silks and practiced laughter, where she was a ghost, a whisper of a memory from seasons past. At 26, she was a relic, an unmarried woman in a society that valued youth and dowries above all else, and she possessed neither. Her fingers tightened on the cool, damp stone of the planter. The music, a jaunty waltz, felt like a mockery, each note a tiny, cheerful hammer against the anvil of her despair. Her aunt had been clear earlier that evening, her voice a mixture of pity and steel. Mr. Finch had made an offer, a generous one, considering the circumstances. The circumstances were ruin. Her late father, a man who had loved books more than ledgers, had left behind a legacy of debt that clung to their family name like a shroud. Mr. Finch was their salvation, a man with damp palms and a laugh that sounded like coins rattling in a dirty pocket. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a final, prized acquisition for his collection of fine things. A chill, entirely separate from the night air, traced a path down her spine. The thought of his touch, of a lifetime tethered to his grubby ambition, made her breath catch in her throat. It was not a marriage, it was a sentence. This ball was meant to be the stage for her polite, soul-crushing acceptance. Her uncle had instructed her to be charming, to smile, to secure their future with the sacrifice of her own. But the smile felt like a crack in porcelain, and the charm had long since withered. All she had left was this cold, hard knot of resignation in her chest. She would do it. She would nod and smile and condemn herself to a life painted in shades of grey. For her family. For the memory of a father who had not known how to provide for her. A sudden shift in the ballroom's atmosphere drew her attention. A hush fell over the chattering crowd, a subtle parting of bodies like iron filings before a magnet. He had arrived. The Duke of Blackwood. Alastair Vance. He was a man carved from shadow and silence. His reputation preceded him into every room, ruthless in business, cold in manner, a spectre at social functions he seemed to despise. He owned half of London and, it was whispered, the souls of those who crossed him. Ilara had only ever seen him from a distance. He was tall, dressed in immaculate black that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, handsome in a way that was unsettling, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. He moved with a predatory grace that made everyone else in the room seem clumsy and loud. He did not mingle. He stood near the grand archway, his dark eyes sweeping the room with an unnerving stillness, a king observing a court of fools. Her uncle found her then, his face flushed with wine and anxiety.
"There you are, Ilara. Mr. Finch is asking for you. It is time."
The words fell like stones into a frozen pond. It is time. The end of her life as she knew it. She allowed her uncle to guide her from the conservatory, her feet feeling like lead. Mr. Finch was waiting, a smug little smile playing on his lips. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her glove in a way that made her skin crawl. "My dear Miss Chilton," he began, his voice oily with false sentiment. "A vision, as always." She could feel the eyes of the room upon them. They knew what this was, a transaction. The sale of a well-bred but impoverished lady to a man of new and vulgar money. Before she could offer the polite, rehearsed lie that was expected of her, another presence eclipsed them. A shadow fell over them, cold and absolute. The Duke of Blackwood stood there. He had moved without a sound. He looked not at her, but at Mr. Finch, his gaze flat and utterly dismissive. The air grew thick with a tension so profound the music itself seemed to falter. "You are holding my fiancé's hand," the Duke said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Mr. Finch paled, his hand dropping from hers as if it had been burned. Your Grace?" Finch stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. The Duke's gaze finally shifted to Ilara. For the first time, she was subjected to the full, unnerving force of his attention. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, and in their depths she saw nothing. No warmth, no emotion, just a chilling, unfathomable calm. He extended a gloved hand to her. It was not a request, it was a command. "Miss Chiltern," he said, his voice a low murmur that was for her alone, "I believe we have a wedding to plan." She stared at his outstretched hand, at the stark black leather against the ballroom's golden light. This was madness, a dream. He had never spoken a word to her in her life. They were strangers, separated by an impassable gulf of status and wealth. Yet her other choice was the leering face of Mr. Finch. Annihilation by slow, suffocating degrees. The Duke offered a different kind of destruction. Swift, clean, absolute. Her hand, trembling almost uncontrollably, lifted and settled into his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip that sent a shock through her entire being. It was not a touch of affection. It was a claim. Without another word, he turned and led her away, the crowd parting before them as if by royal decree. She did not look back. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, could hear the explosion of whispers they left in their wake. She was no longer Ilara Chiltern, the forgotten spinster. She was the Duke of Blackwood's intended, a puzzle no one could solve. And as he led her into the cool, silent night, she had the terrifying realization that she was the most baffled of all. The marriage was a thing of speed and efficiency, devoid of any sentiment. It was a legal contract signed in a dusty solicitor's office with 2 clerks as witnesses. There was no white dress, no flowers, no loving glances. There was only the scratch of a pen and the cold weight of a gold band on her finger. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt like a costume she was ill-suited to wear. Blackwood Manor was much like its master, vast, imposing, and profoundly silent. It was a fortress of grey stone and shadowed halls where her footsteps echoed with an almost accusatory loudness. The servants moved like phantoms, their gazes polite but distant, mirroring the master they served. Her husband, the word felt foreign and strange on her tongue, was a ghost in his own home. He had installed her in a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a palatial prison with views of a meticulously manicured but lifeless garden. His own chambers, she was informed by the stoic housekeeper, were in the West Wing. An entire world of marble and mahogany separated them. They saw each other only at dinner. These meals were agonizing affairs, conducted in a dining hall that could have seated 100. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished table, the distance between them a chasm of unspoken words. He would read documents propped against a silver stand, his attention wholly consumed. He never spoke to her, never asked about her day, never even seemed to register her presence beyond a curt, initial nod. Ilara felt her spirit begin to shrink. She had traded one cage for another, albeit a much more gilded one. The desperation of her former life was replaced by a new kind of emptiness, a profound and echoing loneliness that was somehow worse. She was a duchess, a lady of immense privilege, yet she had never felt more invisible. To pass the endless, silent days, she explored the manor's library. It was her only sanctuary. A magnificent 2-story room filled with the scent of old paper and leather, it was a treasure trove of knowledge and stories.
She lost herself in poetry, in histories, in tales of faraway lands, finding solace in the words of others when her own life had none. It was in the library that the first crack appeared in the Duke's impenetrable armour. One afternoon, while searching for a volume of Greek tragedies, she found a small, leather-bound book of sonnets tucked away on a high shelf. It was not part of the library's catalogue. As she opened it, a slip of paper fell out. It was a note written in a strong, masculine hand.
For a mind that finds solace in verse. There was no signature, but she knew. Her heart gave a strange, uncertain flutter. He had noticed her. He had seen where she spent her days and had left this for her. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, yet in the cold silence of their marriage, it felt like a beacon. Other things began to happen, small, inexplicable acts of quiet consideration. A fire would be lit in her private study on chilly mornings, even before she had risen. The head gardener appeared one day with a selection of rare, beautiful flowers, informing her that His Grace had ordered a section of the greenhouse be cultivated specifically for her personal use, should she desire it. A portfolio of fine drawing paper and charcoals appeared on her writing desk, a silent acknowledgement of a hobby she had not pursued since childhood. He never mentioned these things. Their dinners remained as silent and formal as ever. His expression, when he did happen to look at her, remained unreadable, a mask of cool indifference. It was deeply unsettling. This silent, phantom kindness was more confusing than his coldness had ever been. A cold man was predictable. A man who left secret gifts and ordered gardens planted for a wife he refused to speak to was a dangerous enigma. Who was Alistair Vance? Was he the ruthless duke the world saw? Or was he this quiet observer, this secret purveyor of small comforts? The question began to consume her. She started watching him more closely during their silent meals. She noticed the way his long fingers would sometimes tighten around his wineglass, the knuckles showing white, as if holding back some immense strain. She saw the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. She realized he was not as calm as he appeared. The Duke of Blackwood was a man under immense control, a fortress with walls built so high no one could see the turmoil within. And for some reason he could not, or would not explain, he had brought her inside those walls, only to keep her locked in a distant tower. Her loneliness began to curdle into a strange, burgeoning curiosity. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, a pawn in his mysterious game. She was his wife. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. And she was tired of being a ghost in her own life. The invitation arrived on a silver platter, delivered by the butler. A dinner to be held at the London residence of Lord and Lady Ashworth. It was, the butler informed her, an event His Grace was expected to attend, and by extension, so was she. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Returning to society, the very world that had cast her out, was a terrifying prospect. She would be a spectacle. The penniless spinster who had somehow trapped the nation's most powerful and elusive duke. The whispers would follow her like a cloud of biting insects. She wanted to refuse, to hide in the safety of her library with her books and her solitude. But the thought of Alistair attending alone, of the world speculating about their already strange marriage, solidified her resolve. She would go. She would be his Duchess. The evening of the dinner, she dressed with painstaking care. Her maid helped her into a gown of deep sapphire silk that Alistair had provided, part of an entire wardrobe that had appeared in her rooms shortly after their wedding. It was elegant and understated, but the fabric was so fine it felt like water against her skin. When she descended the grand staircase, he was waiting in the foyer. He was dressed in formal evening attire, the severe black lines of his tailcoat making him seem even taller, more formidable. For a moment, his gaze rested on her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief, unguarded expression she could not decipher, before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. "You are ready?" he stated, not as a question. "I am," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The carriage ride into London was as silent as their dinners. Ilara sat opposite him, twisting the fabric of her gloves in her lap. The city lights flashed across his face, illuminating the hard set of his jaw, the unyielding line of his mouth. He looked like a man heading to a battle, not a dinner party. The Ashworth's home was ablaze with light and sound. The moment they were announced, a hush fell, followed by a wave of murmurs. Ilara's hand instinctively went to Alistair's arm, and she was surprised to find the muscle there was rigid as stone. He was as tense as she was. They moved through the crowd, a solitary island in a sea of curious faces. Alistair's presence was a shield. No one dared approach them directly, but their stares were relentless. It was near the French doors leading to the garden that they were intercepted. Lady Beatrice Finch, a woman whose cruelty was as renowned as her beauty, stepped into their path. She was Mr. Finch's cousin, and her eyes held a particular venomous dislike for Ilara. "Your Grace," she purred, directing a brilliant smile at Alistair that did not reach her cold eyes. "And the new Duchess. How surprising to see you both." Alistair gave a curt, dismissive nod. Lady Beatrice's smile sharpened. Her gaze slid over Ilara, a slow, insulting appraisal. "One must commend you, Miss Chiltern. Oh, I do beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "To secure such a prize, a truly remarkable bargain. I imagine you must be quite overwhelmed by all this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "It is a far cry from a debtor's cottage, is it not?" The insult was clear, public, and designed to humiliate. A sudden, hot shame washed over Ilara. Her breath hitched, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She had no defense against such malice. Before she could even think of a reply, Alistair moved. It was a subtle shift, placing himself slightly in front of her. He looked down at Lady Beatrice, and the cool indifference in his eyes had been replaced by something utterly chilling. The air around them seemed to drop in temperature. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried an unmistakable threat. "I have always found that a person's preoccupation with the finances of others is directly proportional to the instability of their own." Lady Beatrice's smile faltered. I have no idea what you mean." "Do you not?" Alistair continued, his voice lethally soft. "I was reviewing a portfolio this morning regarding a certain shipping venture, one in which your father has invested his entire fortune. An exceptionally risky venture. It would be a tragedy if its primary backer were to suddenly lose confidence." The colour drained from Lady Beatrice's face. The implication was monstrously clear. He could ruin her family with a single word. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper that only the three of them could hear. "My wife's comfort is of paramount importance to me. See that you remember that, or you will find the society you value so highly has a remarkably short memory for your family's name." He straightened up, his expression once again a blank mask. He offered Ilara his arm. "My dear, shall we?" Stunned into silence, she took his arm. He led her away, leaving Lady Beatrice standing frozen, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. He had not just defended her. He had obliterated a threat to her with a cold, calculated precision that was both terrifying and, to her utter confusion,
deeply reassuring. He had called her my wife, and spoken of her comfort as if it were the most important thing in the world. This act of brutal, unwavering protection shattered her perception of him. It was not the gesture of a man who felt nothing for her. It was the act of a man guarding something he considered precious. But why? The question echoed in the silent space between them, louder and more insistent than ever before. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The memory of Alistair's words, the chilling quiet of his fury on her behalf, played over and over in her mind. The silence of their marriage was no longer empty. It was filled with contradictions, with unanswered questions that demanded to be heard. She could not go on like this, living as a stranger in her own home, married to a man who was a fortress of secrets. She needed the truth. Whatever that truth was, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty.
Driven by a resolve she did not know she possessed, she rose from her bed. She wrapped a silk robe over her nightgown, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors of the hallway. The east wing was asleep, shrouded in darkness. She made her way toward the west wing, toward his study, a place she had never dared to enter. A thin line of light shone from beneath the heavy oak door. He was still awake. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was foolish. He was a private man. He would resent this intrusion. But the need to understand was stronger than her fear. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. Silence. Then his voice, low and laced with weariness. "Enter." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was lined with books from floor to ceiling, much like the library, but it was a more personal space. Maps were pinned to one wall, a half-empty glass of brandy sat on a small table, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Alistair was standing by the large window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the grounds. He turned as she entered, and his expression was not of anger, but of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. For a moment he seemed stripped of his ducal authority, just a man alone in the dead of night. "Elara," he said, her name a quiet surprise on his lips. He had never used it before. "I am sorry to disturb you," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But I cannot continue like this." He watched her, his face shadowed, unreadable. "Like what?" "Like this," she said, gesturing to the space between them, to the entire silent, hollow structure of their marriage. "As strangers. You saved me from Mr. Finch. You defended me tonight. You leave me gifts and see to my comfort, but you will not speak to me. You will not even look at me. I must know why. Why did you marry me?" A muscle clenched in his jaw. He turned away from her, back to the window. "I married you to protect you. Is that not enough?" "No," she insisted, stepping further into the room. "It is not. No man, not even you, would shackle himself to a loveless, silent marriage simply to protect a woman he does not know. There is more. You must tell me." He was silent for a long time, his back a rigid line of resistance. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. She thought he would order her out, that he would retreat back behind his walls of ice. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, scraped clean of all its usual control. "You are wrong. I do know you." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. The mask was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so stark, so profound, it was like looking at a stranger. "I have known you my entire life, Elara," he said softly. "We grew up on neighboring estates. I remember you as a girl with grass stains on her dress and wildflowers in her hair, always with a book in your hand. I watched you from a distance at every social gathering for the last decade. I have seen every moment of your quiet grace, your resilience, the way you cared for your father when he grew ill. Ilara stared at him, bewildered. She had no memory of him from her childhood, not really. He was just the reclusive heir to the Blackwood dukedom, a boy who was always kept apart. You watched me?" she whispered. "Always," he confessed, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I loved you. I have loved you since I was a boy of 16, and you were a girl of 14 who did not even know my name. A secret, foolish, and utterly consuming love that has been the one constant in my life." The confession hung in the air between them, so shocking, so impossible, that her mind struggled to comprehend it. This cold, ruthless man loved her? "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "If you felt this way, why the silence? Why this distance? Why treat me like a stranger?" A look of immense pain crossed his features. "Because of what I am. Because of the man my father was." He walked over to his desk, his movements heavy. "My father was a cruel man, Ilara. He and my mother had a marriage that was a masterpiece of misery. He controlled her, belittled her, and broke her spirit until there was nothing left. I grew up in a house that was a monument to the destruction that a man can visit upon a woman he professes to love." He picked up the brandy glass, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly. "I swore I would never become him. I saw his coldness, his temper, his capacity for cruelty in myself. I believed I was cursed with the same darkness. To love you, truly love you, would be to risk destroying you, as he destroyed my mother, and I could not bear that." His words painted a horrifying picture, explaining the fortress he had built around himself. "So I kept my distance," he went on, his voice ragged. "I condemned myself to a life of watching you from afar. But then your father died. I saw your family's ruin, and I saw Finch circling you like a vulture. I knew what a life with him would be. I could not stand by and watch you be thrown to a man like that. It was the one thing I could not endure." He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "So I made a choice. I would marry you to save you. I would give you my name, my protection, my fortune, everything I had. But I would keep my heart, my cursed, broken self, far away from you. It was the only way I knew how to love you without destroying you." The truth was so much larger, so much more painful and complex than anything she could have imagined. It was not a marriage of convenience. It was a sacrifice, a misguided, agonizing act of love from a man who believed himself to be a monster. Her own heart ached for him, for the lonely boy he had been and the tormented man he had become. All the coldness, all the silence. It was not indifference. It was fear. Before she could speak, before she could bridge the gap between them and tell him he was wrong, a sharp, frantic knock sounded at the study door. Alistair's head snapped up, his expression instantly hardening, the Duke's mask falling back into place. "What is it?" he called out, his voice sharp. A footman entered, his face pale and agitated. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Mr. Finch is here. He insists on seeing you. He says it is a matter of the utmost urgency concerning the Duchess."
A cold dread washed over Ilara. Finch. Here. Now. Alistair's eyes narrowed.
"Send him in." Mr. Finch strode into the room, his usual smugness amplified by a triumphant sneer. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. He ignored Ilara completely, his focus entirely on Alistair. "Your Grace," Finch said, his voice slick with malice. "I came as soon as I uncovered the truth.
I felt it my duty to warn you about the viper you have taken into your home. Speak plainly, Finch, or I will have you thrown out, Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. Finch smiled, a nasty, predatory thing. I have proof. Proof that your so-called innocent wife has been plotting against you from the very beginning. She never cared for you. It was always about your fortune. She has been corresponding with her uncle, detailing her plans to secure a significant portion of your assets before manufacturing a separation. He thrust the papers onto Alistair's desk. Letters, in her own hand. Ilara's blood ran cold. That's a lie. I have never written such things. Alistair picked up the top letter. Ilara could see the handwriting. It was a masterful forgery of her own elegant script. The words were vile, cold, and calculating, speaking of the Duke as a cold fool, easily manipulated. She watched Alistair's face as he read. She saw the flicker of doubt, then the dawning horror. She saw his deepest, most profound fear, that he was unlovable, a target to be used, being laid bare. The confession he had just made, the vulnerability he had just shown her, was now the very weapon being used against him. Alistair, look at me, she pleaded, her voice trembling. It is not true. He is lying. But he wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the forged words, and in them he was seeing the confirmation of every terrible thing he believed about himself and the world. He was seeing his father's cynical warnings, his mother's misery. He was seeing proof that his love was a fool's errand. His face, which moments before had been open with pain and love, became a mask of stone, colder and more impenetrable than she had ever seen it. The devastation in his eyes was absolute. He looked from the letters to her, and his gaze was that of a stranger, a wounded, betrayed stranger. So this was all it ever was, he said, his voice flat, dead. A performance, a well-played game to secure your future. No, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You cannot believe him. Get out, Finch, Alistair snarled, not taking his eyes off Ilara. Finch, looking immensely pleased with his work, gave a short bow and backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. They were alone again, but the fragile intimacy of moments before had been shattered, replaced by a chasm of poison and lies. Alistair, please, she begged, taking a step toward him. Do not, he commanded, his voice cracking with a pain so deep it physically hurt to hear it. He gestured around the opulent room. Take what you want. The jewels, the gowns, anything. It is all you ever desired anyway. Fulfill the plans in your letters. He walked to the door, his movements stiff, broken. He stopped with his hand on the handle, his back to her. I want you gone from this house by morning, he said, each word a shard of glass. Leave my estate. Be gone from my sight. And then he was gone, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a sound of utter finality, leaving her alone in the wreckage of his confession and his condemnation. The silence that descended was no longer empty, it was screaming. The Duke's words echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart. Be gone from my sight. For a long moment she could not move, frozen by the sheer brutal force of his pain and his accusation. He had opened his soul to her, only to have it trampled by a crude lie. He had not believed her. In the end, his demons had been more persuasive than she was. A wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown her washed over her.
But then something else rose through the sorrow, a spark of anger, not at Alistair, but at Finch, at a world that had tried to break her, sell her, and now slander her.
She would not be broken. Her gaze fell upon his desk, littered with the forged letters, and beside them, lying innocuously beneath a heavy paperweight, was a folded document of thick, yellowed parchment. She recognized the seal of his family solicitors. It was a deed. She had seen him studying it a few nights before, his expression distant and melancholic. She had overheard him speaking with his closest friend, Lord Ashworth, about the property. Willow Creek, a small, almost forgotten parcel of land with a run-down cottage. It was, Ashworth had explained, the only property the Duke's mother had ever owned in her own name, a place she had loved, a place she had escaped to. It held no monetary value, but its sentimental worth to Alistair was immeasurable. And she also remembered something else, a snippet of conversation she had overheard between Finch and another businessman weeks ago. They had spoken of a small, seemingly worthless property bordering the Blackwood estate, one that held the key to a rich coal seam they intended to acquire through deceit. Willow Creek. Finch's plan was not just to hurt Alistair emotionally, he wanted to ruin him, to take the one piece of his heritage that held any true meaning for him. A desperate, audacious idea formed in her mind. He had told her to take what she wanted. He believed her a thief. What if she played the part? She would not leave empty-handed. She would leave with the one thing he treasured, not to harm him, but to protect him. She would take the deed to Willow Creek. It would be a final, silent message, an act he would not understand until he was free of Finch's poison. It would force him to seek her out, to confront the truth. Her movements became swift, purposeful. She returned to her rooms and changed out of her fine silk robe and into a simple, sturdy traveling dress. She packed a small bag with only the barest of essentials. She did not take a single piece of jewelry, not a single coin from the purse he kept filled for her. Then she returned to the study. The forged letters were still on the desk, a testament to the night's destruction. She ignored them. With a steady hand, she lifted the paperweight, took the deed to Willow Creek, and folded it carefully, tucking it into the bodice of her dress. She wrote a short, simple note, leaving it on the center of his desk. It contained only 3 words. You are wrong. As the first pale grey light of dawn began to streak the sky, Ilara Chilton, the Duchess of Blackwood, walked out of the grand front doors of the manor. She did not look back. She walked down the long gravel drive, a lone, determined figure disappearing into the morning mist. She was gone. And so was the deed to his land. Alistair did not sleep. He sat in the dark of his private drawing room, the brandy glass empty at his side, and let the silence consume him. The pain was a living entity, a cold, heavy thing settled in his chest. Every word of her forged letters was burned into his memory, confirming his deepest fears. He was a fool, a cold, unlovable fool who had dared to hope. When morning came, the house was unnervingly quiet. He had expected shouting, the sounds of trunks being packed, of a woman claiming her spoils. But there was nothing. He forced himself to his study, dreading the sight of her, the final confrontation. But the room was empty, and on his desk lay her note. You are wrong. The simple words struck him with a force that took his breath away. There was no anger in them, no justification. Just a quiet, resolute statement of fact. His housekeeper appeared at the door, her face etched with concern. Your Grace, the Duchess, she is gone. Her bed was not slept in. A maid saw her walking down the drive at dawn. She took nothing with her. Nothing. The word did not compute. A thief did not leave empty-handed.
A frantic, terrible doubt began to claw at the edges of his certainty. He scanned the desk, his eyes searching for something, anything, out of place. And then he saw it. The paperweight was askew. The deed to Willow Creek was gone.
Of all the things she could have taken, priceless jewels, bonds, cash, she had taken a worthless piece of land, the one thing that meant something only to him. It made no sense. A thief took what was valuable. They did not take memories. Just then, Lord Ashworth burst into the study, his face flushed, his eyes wide with alarm. "Alistair, thank God I have found you. We have a problem. A big one." "Ilara is gone," Alistair said, his voice hollow. I know, but you must listen," Ashworth insisted, his usual joviality gone. "My man just brought me word. He overheard Finch boasting in a tavern last night. The letters he showed you were forgeries, Alistair, expertly done. It was all a ploy. He has been trying to acquire Willow Creek for months, knows you would never sell. His plan was to drive a wedge between you and the Duchess, force her out, and then somehow use the chaos to get his hands on the deed." The world tilted on its axis. Forgery. A ploy. Every word Ashworth spoke was a hammer blow, shattering the cold, brittle certainty that had sustained him through the night. He looked at the note again. You are wrong. She had been telling the truth. And he, in his arrogant pain, in his blind servitude to the ghosts of his past, had not listened. He had thrown her out. He had accused her of the very thing her soul was incapable of. And she had taken the deed. He finally understood. It was not an act of theft. It was an act of protection. She had taken the one thing Finch was after, the one thing she knew he could not bear to lose, and she had taken it to keep it safe, to save it for him, to save him from himself. A wave of shame and regret so powerful it brought him to his knees washed over him. He had called her a viper, and she had been his guardian. He had called her a thief, and she had been his savior. "The cottage," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She has gone to the cottage at Willow Creek." He did not wait for a reply. He ran from the room, shouting for his fastest horse to be saddled. He rode like a man possessed, the wind whipping at his face, his heart pounding with a desperate prayer. Let him not be too late. Let him have a chance to undo the terrible wrong he had done. The cottage at Willow Creek was just as he remembered from his childhood visits with his mother. Small, stone-built, and half overgrown with ivy, it looked forlorn and forgotten. Smoke curled from its chimney. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. He pushed open the creaking wooden door. She was there. She was on her knees before the small hearth, coaxing a flame from the kindling. She looked up as he entered, her face smudged with soot. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, weary sadness. "Alistair?" she said, simply. He stood there, unable to speak, the chasm of his failure stretching between them. "I have the deed," she said, her voice quiet. "It is safe." "Ilara," he finally managed, his voice breaking. "Forgive me." He crossed the small room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her small, soot-stained hands in his. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I let my past, my fears, speak for me. I believed a lie because it was easier than believing I was worthy of your truth. Can you ever forgive me?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. "I saw the man you are behind the walls you built, a man who deserved to be trusted. I am only sorry my trust was not enough to convince you." "It is now," he said,
his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his coat and pulled out the forged letters. Without a word, he tossed them into the fledgling fire. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the lies vanishing into smoke. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his heart bare, his soul open. I love you, Ilara. I have loved you for so long, and I have done it so badly. Let me start again. Let me be the husband you deserve, not a ghost in the halls, but a man by your side. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance, of homecoming. It was a gentle, healing touch that promised a new beginning. There is no need to start again, she murmured against his lips. We can simply begin. A year later, Blackwood Manor was a different place. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter that echoed in the once sombre halls. Sunlight streamed through windows that had long been kept shuttered, illuminating rooms filled with flowers from Ilara's greenhouse. The staff, who had once moved like ghosts, now smiled freely. The manor was no longer a fortress, it was a home. Alastair was a changed man. The cold, unreadable Duke was gone, replaced by a husband whose devotion was evident in every glance, every touch. He had dismantled the walls around his heart, brick by brick, and in their place, Ilara's love had cultivated a garden. She stood with him on the grand terrace, looking out over the flourishing grounds as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" he asked softly, his voice a warm murmur against her ear. "You have told me the story 100 times, she teased gently. I had grass stains on my dress and was trying to climb the old oak on the edge of your father's property. You were the freest thing I had ever seen, he said, his voice filled with reverence. And I, in my fear, tried to put you in a cage, even a gilded one. Thank you for not letting me." She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. The stark, handsome angles of his face were softened now by happiness. "You were the one who held the key all along," she said. "You just needed to be brave enough to use it." Their life was not a fairy tale. It was something real and enduring, built not on a flawless beginning, but on the courage to rebuild from the wreckage of their fears. They had found their way through the darkness, not by ignoring the shadows of the past, but by choosing to walk together into the light.
True freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of walls, but the choice of who you let inside them. And his love, once a secret, silent thing, was now the truest home she had ever known.